Place I want to start, I want to talk about not just my books, but my books in relation to not just how they arose, but in relation to what was going on in the United States, what was going on in Washington, what was going on in China, and how that fit into the career of a working journalist. So the first point I want to make to all of you is I'm not a China hand in the conventional sense of the word. China hand in the conventional sense, and there are many, many really good ones. I think of as people who studied Chinese, high school, college, may have put in, and goes back decades, a year in China at Beida or some other university, and then later on came back to China to write about it. I only spent 3 years in the 1980s in China. Those were good years, they were intense, but I came from Washington, I came back to Washington. I had no sense that I was going to cover China until about, 8 months before I landed there, when I had been covering the US Supreme Court for a long 8 years, and I had a foreign editor who said to me, "Would you like to go overseas?" And I said, "Yeah. What did you have in mind?" The year was 83. He said, "Well, Moscow or Beijing." And I thought about it. China seemed much more interesting. The Cold War was raging, and I thought that if I was going to cover Moscow, I might not ever get out of Moscow. I would be sitting there doing the reaction to the latest arms control proposal, and that was more boring to me than covering China that was changing a bit, or so it seemed. So I covered China, its politics, its society, its protests at the time, having really not specialized in China at all. I think when that foreign editor interested in me going to China, for the next 4 years, I did not read a single book that was not Chinese history or Chinese politics and Chinese culture. To the extent that I'm a China hand from those days, it was entirely self-taught. I was planning to go to China in the summer of 1984. Ronald Reagan was about to make a trip to China that year. The newspaper said, "Well, why don't you go along? Because you can take a look at the surroundings, you can look at your apartment, what you're going to be doing, you can look at schools for your kids." And I went, and I remember on that Reagan trip that America was in a way being sold a bill of goods, because the entire thrust of the press coverage of China was China's westernizing. There were Time magazine covers that showed people playing golf in China. Zhao Ziyan played golf. And you got from those images the idea that China was westernizing rapidly. And reading my two favorite books, both became my views of China. One was Jonathan Spence's classic book, To Change China, which has a series of essays of people going way back for 300 or 400 years, of Westerners who came to China with the idea of changing it and ended up frustrated in one way or another. And the other was a book by Harold Isaacs called Scratches on Our Minds, analyzed the Western images of China as compared to the reality. So I landed in China, and I was already working on my first book, because before I got there, I had talked to it. I knew I wanted to do, besides covering China, I had books in mind. I had thrown out the idea of following one American company, starting up in China, seeing how it went. So I chose the company. It was American Motors, which was then making the Jeep, first auto venture in China. I was looking at a bunch of other companies too. I was originally thinking maybe I would do several companies at once, and they're mentioned in the book. But really, what I did was follow a single company trying to start up in China. Some of the ventures and the wackiness and the conflicts took place as it started up. Even now, I'm thinking it would be a great nostalgia movie. You go back to the 1980s, American Motors was trying to bring state enterprise Beijing Automotive Work leaders to Las Vegas to an auto show. People come from Beijing and the grayness of Beijing. American Motors thought this would be a great idea to bring leaders that they were trying to do business with to Las Vegas. The Chinese leaders this is 1984, had not seen anything like this before, and they eventually walked out. They got to see American Motors, and the auto show was bringing in girls in bikinis. There was gambling going on. Shocked, there's gambling going on. That set the framework for startup in China, which of course immediately ran into all kinds of logjams, cultural, financial too, because what American Motors wanted to do was get its money out of China, and the Chinese said, no, China doesn't change that easily. I will give you the last paragraph of the book, which I think stands up very well today, over 30 years. There will always be limits on what foreign businesses may do and sell inside China. If there ever is a truly unified China market, it will likely be captured not by the foreigners who've been pursuing this commercial dream for more than a century, but first of all by the Chinese themselves. So the book came out in 1989. By then I was back in DC. And again, this is the 1980s. The biggest foreign policy stories of the era were the Cold War and the Middle East. And I had been sitting out in China, covering China, but also looking at what stories there were about China in Washington. I noticed quickly the savviest people in all of the news came out of the Hong Kong press, the Taiwan press, the Far Eastern Economic Review, but not big American newspapers. The last to know what was going on in any savvy way were the LA Times, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. My Washington bureau chief said, what do you want to do when you come back? And I said, well, I want to join the foreign policy team. He said, well, we have two people doing that. And I said, yeah, one of them is terrific and covers Cold War, and one of them is terrific and he covers the Middle East. And you're out there saying to everybody, we're the newspaper of the Pacific. I want to cover Asia policy. And there was tremendous resistance to my doing that, but not that much resistance because in the 1980s, maybe thanks to Ronald Reagan's defense budget, the LA Times was the richest paper in the country. I mean, there were jokes about the LA Times that newsboys would throw it on people's doorstep and kill a dog because it was so fat with ads. When I persisted, they said, okay, we'll add a third person to the foreign policy team. And there proceeded a period of 5 years or more in which I was virtually the only member of the Washington press corps, certainly for a big city newspaper, who was spending all his time on Asia. So I was really watching China policy through the 1980s. Actually, the biggest story when I came back was Japan is buying Washington, Japan is buying the United States, and so on. China wasn't even the leading story in Asia. But I've been back only 2 years when crowds began to swell Tiananmen Square, and my newspaper sent me back to cover them. So I was there before and during the Tiananmen crackdown. And then I came back, covered for several years Washington policy in the aftermath of Tiananmen. So that included the George H.W. Bush policy, those years when he was desperately trying to preserve the old relationship, sending Grant Scowcroft and Larry Eagleburger on secret missions to China that would be exposed and the Democrats would protest. And Bill Clinton came to office promising to change policy and imposing limits on China's most favored nation benefits. I was covering all of this, and I got to a point, done well enough, that their editors were asking, do you want to do another book? My first idea was I was just going to do those 4 years or so, 1988 to 93 or 4. Editors in New York were saying, China, I don't know. You're only doing 2 or 3 or 4 years. Can we interest you in a book about Bosnia? Their thing stood when there was an extraneous event, a bit of lucky research on my part. Because I had time to wander as a reporter, the government printing office, otherwise known as GPO, used to have a bookstore. They would put whatever was coming out of government printing offices for people to buy. And I used to go take a look and rummage through it. And one time I went through and I saw a book called, it was a pamphlet really, 98 pages, called Chinese Political Negotiating Behavior. Well, I just finished business negotiations. I was interested in the subject. I was reading it and it was pretty anodyne. Didn't have too much to say. But I looked at the back and it said, this is a synopsis of study number R233 by the National Intelligence Council. And I filed for that study under the Freedom of Information Act. And I have to say that I've never, ever had any success using the Freedom of Information Act, except in this case, and it took 4 years. This quest to get this study went, I think it went first to CIA, and they said, no, go to the National Security Council, and they said, no, go to the State Department. And I asked the LA Times to sue for it, and the General Counsel in LA said, no one ever wins lawsuits against the CIA. But I knew they did from a Washington perspective because I was a good friend of a guy named Scott Armstrong who had set up the National Security Archive. And I said, who do you use to sue the CIA? And I finally was put in touch with a lawyer who filed suit to get this study. It took a lot more time, but in the mid-90s, lo and behold, there arrived in my mailbox 2 thick 200-page documents. One of them was this study itself, and it turned out it was written by a guy I had known before and know later on, Richard Solomon. The study you can now buy for the RAND Corporation, and it was an analysis of all the ways China uses in negotiations with the United States. It included some wonderful anecdotes and quotes. For one example, there's Henry Kissinger quote, "After a banquet of Peking duck, I'll sign anything." Is all of the things that are left out of Kissinger's memoir, which is both wonderfully written and incredibly incomplete. But that was only one part, because there was a second 200-page document. And the second 200-page document was the appendix. And the appendix listed every interaction or event between the United States and China from 1967, when Richard Nixon wrote a foreign affairs article suggesting a change in American relations with China, through the Nixon opening and all the way up to the early 1980s. Genesis for the study was the Reagan administration had gotten locked into negotiations over arms sales to Taiwan and had felt they had been out-negotiated and commissioned a study of how did the Chinese do it. So I looked at this study. There are anecdotes and morsels of information in nowhere Kissinger-controlled record. For example, Nixon and Kissinger tried to get the Chinese, to get North Vietnamese officials to come to China and meet with them during the Nixon trip. I mean, the Chinese wanted no part of trying to force the North Vietnamese into direct face-to-face negotiations. All kinds of little things like that. And I looked at this, and after a while, I said, wait a minute, why should I talk about a study of the United States and China for 3 years, from Tiananmen to mid-Clinton? Let's do the whole thing. So I went back and I said, let's do a history of America's relations with China, starting with Nixon. And that worked. The part of me that's simply an archives freak. I love to find documents. I like to work in presidential libraries. In this particular case, I was living out in Silver Spring, and Richard Nixon's papers, presidential papers, had been taken from him after Watergate. They're now out in California at the Nixon Library, but for several years they were 5 miles away from me. So I went out there and I started going through the Nixon papers. I found Nixon's own handwritten notes, which are in the book, as he's going to China and as he's stopping in Honolulu, and Henry Kissinger is briefing him. Just as an example, this is all in Nixon's handwriting. This is how to deal with Mao. Treat him as an emperor. Don't quarrel. Don't praise him too much. Praise poems, love of country. And then he started thinking about the hard policy issues, and it cuts right to the essence of what's not in their memoirs. Taiwan equals Vietnam equals trade-off. Your people expect action on Taiwan. Our American people expect action on Vietnam. Neither can act immediately, but both are inevitable. Let us not embarrass each other. So you really got a feel for the Nixon interactions. And this book, which is about face, half revisionist history, because it's a revisionist history of the opening, and half new history because no one had really done post-1989 part of the book. I had had a bird's eye. In fact, when I had gotten back from Tiananmen, in the months after that, you have to look at the dynamics at the time. The Cold War was just ending. Everything was in flux. And for a few months, the Chinese students in this country, extremely patriotic. Their patriotism for a while was opposed to the regime. And they were afraid that they would be sent back to the country which had just carried out this massacre in Beijing. They went to Congress to look for protection so that they wouldn't be forced back. They needed new visa protection. And so they were smart enough to say, well, who's got the largest number of Chinese Americans, not necessarily students, in their district? Hey, it's San Francisco. And so they went to the congresswoman from San Francisco, who was then in her second term, very young, named Nancy Pelosi. And that was the beginning of Pelosi's interest in China. In a way, it was the counterpart of me in the sense that she was one of the only members of Congress who was interested in China, the way I was one of the only members who was doing it day to day. And so, we spoke regularly over those early years and throughout this book, and she's one of the leading characters in this book. After the book came out, there were a couple of years when she didn't talk to me because I had described what was in those days her stammering, halting speaking style. We later came back around to become friends. The book comes out and I go off to do other things. It is the book with the longest shelf life of all my books in the sense that it's used in college courses today. So I go back, the book comes out the end of the 90s. And I went back to covering foreign policy. Then I decided to go off and write books full time. First book I did was not a China book. It did turn out to be probably the best known outside of China hands and was the best selling of all my books. It was called Rise of the Vulcans, a group biography of the people who brought us war in Iraq. Biography of 6 people. In a way, the idea for that book also grew out of previous China book, in the sense that in writing about China policy, I had dealt with 2 Republicans who were involved in Asia. One was Paul Wolfowitz, and one was Richard Armitage, and I would see them and talk to them all the time. At one point in talking about Asia policy, they reminisced about how there were all these conflicts at the top of the Reagan administration, and then they would get together and settle things off. And so I thought at the beginning of the 2000s, when every diplomat in Washington was saying tremendous tensions within this administration, they were right, but I thought maybe that was just a construct and that wouldn't turn out to be true. And I was completely wrong, but it was the right book to write. So that book came out in 2004 as the war in Iraq was raging. I caught some flack from my friends. Flack that I caught was that, like About Face, actually, this was not an opinionated book. This is, here are these people, here's how this policy came about, very few judgments. By the time the book came out, war in Iraq is flaming. I had friends saying, geez, how can you be so dispassionate and clinical about everything? I don't know if that was a factor or not, but meanwhile, I signed on to write a book that I eventually did about Reagan's foreign policy. I wasn't finished with covering China. In the 90s, here in Washington, when you talked about China, it was though people were talking within a box. The dialogue fell into specific patterns. I began to think about, what is it that produces this mentality? Why can't people think out of it? And so I began thinking about the assumptions. Some of them, my friends, in talking about China, of this assumption. Trade was going to eventually open up China, trade and investment. China was going to become increasingly prosperous. As it did, it was bound to open up. This isn't just the assumptions of the foreign policy wonks that I was hanging around in. This is in the speeches, for sure. This is Bill Clinton giving a speech saying, you think that China's going to control the internet. That's like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. It's one speech after another, one formulation after another about the inevitability of China's changing with trade. Honestly, I went off to Germany to look at Reagan's aspects of the Cold War, and meanwhile, before I left, I said, I gotta write this China book, and I got permission from my editor to just do it. And so, starting, believe it or not, writing about China from a basement in Berlin, I sat there and kind of started this book that really turned out to an extended essay on the American views of China. This book is now known for its main thesis, correctly, that trade and investment will not liberalize China. Just to give you a couple of passages on the main thesis, what if 25 or 30 years from now, a wealthier, more powerful China continues to be run by a one-party regime that still represses organized political dissent, much as it does today, while at the same time, China is also open to the outside world and indeed is deeply intertwined with the rest of the world through trade, investment, and other economic ties. Everyone assumes that the Chinese political system is going to open up, but what if it doesn't? What if, in other words, China becomes fully integrated into the world's economy, yet it remains entirely democratic? The related assumption was this American notion that the US was going to integrate China into the American-led international system. The second part of the book, what was the integration fantasy, that was going to be easy for the US to integrate China into the world's economy. Fundamental problem with this strategy of integration is it raises the obvious question, who's integrating whom? Is the United States now integrating China into a new international economic order based upon free market principles? Or on the other hand, is China now integrating the United States into a new international political order where democracy is no longer favored and where a government's continuing eradication of all organized political opposition is accepted or ignored? Beyond that, I really tried to examine the discourse, political lingo with which critics of American China policy, critics of the Chinese Communist Party were dismissed. So the subtitle of the book is How Our Leaders Explain Away Chinese Repression. So I looked at the language that gets used. It was that anybody who criticized the Chinese Communist Party or who criticized American China policy was anti-China, not anti-Chinese Communist Party, just anti-China. Or they had a Cold War mentality. It was the language and the semantics with which anybody who questioned China policy was labeled, branded, and dismissed. The book came out, the New York Times did a piece called Book Creates a Stir, or Book Creates a Controversy, by a good friend of mine, Richard Bernstein, quoting people who are now friends of mine, David Shambaugh, and dismissing the book. People who now come back around and sometimes say you were right or you were prescient and so on. My office at Johns Hopkins back in those days was on Think Tank Alley, Mass Ave. There were one or two China hands who actually walked to the other side of the street. From an in-house perspective, I don't know if any of you see, Bill Bishop publishes a newsletter called Sinosphere. Sism, that's right, thanks Charles. And I credit him with, jokingly, with keeping the book alive because his website mentions events that are going on in China and things being published. And I don't know, once every 3 or 4 months he would say, this reminds me of the China fantasy, or how come no one's talking about the China fantasy? My book was deliberately ignored for 5, 6, 7 years. And then I credit its resurgence to Xi Jinping, who, as things progressed, and China wasn't liberalizing at all, becoming ever more controlling. I found myself going from being an outcast to being called prescient, which I was not. I think I merely wrote what was out there. And I think I'll stop there. I'm delighted to take questions and engage in discussion on this.
There's been kind of an inversion in American politics recently, more generally, that as it relates to China, Republicans have been more the very virulent China hawks, while the Democrats have certainly been very critical, but a little bit less than Republicans. Do you think that there's going to be generally a shift in terms of how American politicians generally treat China?
I lived through the years in the 70s when mainstream China thinking set by the Republicans was very much in favor of engagement with China, and the Democrats in different ways complained. They were the critics. Immediately after Tiananmen, again, I had a reaction that this is ridiculous when the Trump people put out the idea that they were inviting Xi Jinping to the inaugural. We can talk, and it's an interesting question, what they thought they were doing, but there's no way that that was going to happen, and I don't think that any of them who knew anything thought it was going to happen. This is just a signal and rhetoric. If you go back to only last year, the Biden administration and Biden invited Xi Jinping to San Francisco. The preparations for that took months, and the Chinese main concern was security. It went over security arrangements over and over and over again. And this was in nice San Francisco. The idea that Xi Jinping was even going to be willing to come to Washington in the middle of an inaugural with crowds all over the place, Proud Boys and who knew what. In their minds, security officials' minds, a country where someone can even take a shot. It was one of the biggest non-starters I ever saw. And so I think it was meant as some odd kind of signal. We're good guys, or we're not starting out hardline on China. Current policy, or what to expect, first of all, I think Trump policy is going to be, this fits in with Trump as self-image, as deal maker. There'll be tariffs, but there'll be concessions made, maybe too many concessions made in negotiations with the Chinese. 2 points about the existing team as it's emerging. The first thing that everybody wrote about, the point is China hawks, China hawks. Well, most of Washington are China hawks now. So the question to me is, what kind of China hawks? The first is, these are the Asia First China hawks. I recommend that you go look at The Economist a week or two before the election. And there's a piece by the new National Security Advisor, which really lays out a strategy that says basically we need to get out of Ukraine as fast as we can and turn our attention completely away from Europe to Asia. And certainly Vance, becoming vice president, has been saying the same thing. That's one strand of hawks. The people who supported Ukraine, or who made the argument that withdrawing from Ukraine would be a terrible signal to China on Taiwan, did not end up in the administration. Pompeo, Pottinger, several others. So that's where they want to go. I think it's a terrible message and the wrong strategy. They have a negative view of alliances and want to talk about tariffs on Europe and Japan. The Chinese Communist Party's goal for the last 10 years, one of them, has been to create divisions between the United States and Europe, the United States and Japan. It's giving a victory that the Chinese Communist Party wouldn't have expected. The other point to make is, these are the China hawks. These are also kind of the tech bro China hawks. These are the ban TikTok China hawks. Defense industry has been changing from the old line, sort of Grumman and so on, to this new Palantir and other defense industries. We're going to build what we think is a good weapons system for China, and there's going to be a war with China. Persuade the Pentagon to give us contracts to buy these things. That's kind of an underside to the China hawks, and that's one that bothers me.
My question is whether or not you think Xi Jinping was kind of like a monumental shift towards authoritarianism and kind of like abandoning the idea of liberalizing as a way to get close to the US, or was it just something was never meant to be, that it was just like putting up a show to mask what's really going on?
I don't think everything started with Xi Jinping. There are the old kind of economic hands in Washington think that everything started with Xi Jinping. I don't. Xi Jinping represented a change in a different way, which is in the immediate aftermath of the Soviet Union. The Chinese Communist Party did not want a strong leader like Gorbachev. And so you had a relatively weak party secretary, Hu Jintao. But certainly the change with Xi Jinping was, first, I think he got the job, in part because he was part of the sons of party elite, his father being part of the old crowd. There are really two steps. Anti-corruption, which is also linked with seizing control of the party from rivals, and then gradually pursuing this anti-corruption campaign in a way that continued to increase his power. So you're right about that. It's not as though everything started with Xi Jinping, but he began to amass power to the point that even good old free traders in Washington who thought that everything was going to turn out wonderful kind of recognized that this was not the China that they thought we were headed for.
The economics of it is that the Chinese have basically surpassed us in production and exports all over the world. It's not so much that China is going to go free enterprise or capitalist, but the United States will become more like how they produce things in China if it's ever going to compete with China.
I understand where you're coming from, and there's a lot to it. It's a slightly dimmer view of what's going to happen in this country than I have. But it also fits in with my who's integrating whom here. There's no way that no matter what happens, that the United States is going to end up with an economic system like China's. And China's is going to, I think it will be spectacular in science and engineering, and maybe even do well on innovation. Not sure about that. The overall Chinese economy, technology aside, the growth is coming down. More and more reliant on exports. Other countries are becoming more and more skeptical about exports. It's not just the United States, it's certainly Europe. I wouldn't be really rosy about the Chinese economy. Science and engineering will probably be right up there, probably better than the United States over the coming years. Your question is on what should the China policy be? First of all, I'm not in favor of what we're going to see, which is total chaos. I did meet with Kim Jong-un. It was all going to be personal contacts with Trump and his family. We're going to solve everything. It's kind of lost in the history now, but the Chinese persuaded the Kushners that they were friends of China. There was a period in which Xi Jinping came to Mar-a-Lago and the Kushners sang songs for him. I think, again, there's going to be an effort at deal-making. It may not be familial in the same sense, because I think that the family, I mean, who knows what private deals they will cut, but I'm more worried about the friends, Elon Musk's, Peter Thiel's, and their companies, and the deals that will get cut to benefit them. TikTok as an abstract issue, yes, there are security concerns about TikTok. The secondary question is, there's a forced transfer of TikTok. Who's going to buy it? Going to be friends of the administration? Are they going to be able to buy it cheap? I think that's out there. And I think I've seen some of these people over the last few years running around on TikTok who are connected to companies that want to buy TikTok. That's going to be part of the warp and woof of China policy over the next couple of years. I don't think there's going to be a consistent thread. Less so than in the first administration. I think there are going to be efforts at deals. I think this invitation is Xi Jinping. See, he tried to have a relationship with them, but he turned it down, so now we're going to be tough. Oh, well, maybe, we're going to impose tariffs. Well, maybe we're not. I see it as chaos that Trump likes.
You mentioned that in the 1990s, when everybody was still talking about how China going to liberalize because of its economic growth and everything, you saw it in a different way. So I was wondering, what was the reason that made you have a different conclusion?
Two reasons. I guess they're related. The first is intellectually, people were buying into this non-China intellectual climate of the end of history, that everything was going to change. I never felt that way. But secondly, I'd lived in China. I had a feel for what China was like. It did not fit into these images of a China that was easy to change and willing to liberalize. It didn't fit into my images of the Chinese Communist Party. It didn't fit into my images of China's history. Let me give one other bit of history, because I didn't mention this for the 80s. My interest was in human rights in China. In the 70s and 80s, the drive to sweep repression in China under the rug had almost nothing to do with the business community. It was the Cold War. The United States needed to cooperate with China in dealing with the Soviet Union. It having those 40 Soviet divisions that had to be up on the border with China as a defense mechanism, it wanted them there. Everything was strategic. It was in that context that anytime anybody mentioned the human rights system in China or repression, a total lack of free speech, the U.S. would kind of sweep it under the rug, minimize it. It had nothing to do with business. The dynamic was, we don't make too much fuss about it. What amazed me in the 90s, coincidentally, by the end of the 80s, China becomes the last untapped market for investment in the world, in the eyes of the business community. At the same time as the Cold War is ending, the business community pretty quickly is turning to China as a tremendous market in their minds. In my mind, I could also see that there were dynamics behind this idea that China was going to change. Although it's harder to find the exact words. The argument was made in the Cold War in the 70s and 80s that we don't have to worry about this because China's going to change. It all became much stronger in the 90s, but it was there even in the 80s, but for strategic reasons, not economic reasons. And so because I'd seen that previous dynamic, I guess I was more skeptical of the same argument and the same dynamics playing out with the business community. Shanghai's loss has been Washington's tremendous gain as having a haven for intellectual discussions of China.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, everyone. And we'll proceed with the signing section.